Hello, students. Next, we're going to talk about African cultures. So, peoples in the West, Central, and Southern Africa developed diverse governments and lifestyles. By viewing this lecture, I hope that at the end you'll be able to describe the culture of early West African kingdoms, describe the lifestyles of early Central and Southern African peoples. Let's start with the lay of the land. Between 400 and 1500 AD, there were three empires that rose and fell in West Africa: Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. These empires prospered primarily by trading two types of commodities, gold and salt. Geography helped determine where these empires arose. West Africa is bordered on the north by the Mediterranean Sea and on the west and south by the Atlantic Ocean. Its northern and southern perimeters are well watered and fertile, but between them lies a vast expanse of the Sahara, whose name comes from the ancient Arabic word meaning desert. At the edges of the Sahara are regions of scrub forest and rolling grass called savanna. Other important trade routes went across the Sahara. Arab merchants introduced camels to the region between the 3rd and 5th centuries, and this revolutionized trade. Early merchants had trekked through the desert using smaller animals, oxen, donkeys, and horses, but they could not carry as much weight or last as long without water. Because of this, most trade remained local. People living on the edges of the Sahara would exchange food for salt mined in the desert. The camels, however, could go over a week without water and could easily withstand the scorching days and cold nights. Although crossing the Sahara was still risky, camels enabled merchants to open up the long-distance trade routes across the deserts. What did they trade? Gold, ivory, ostrich feathers, and furs were soon moved from the south of the Sahara to North Africa and Europe. Ideas as well as goods traveled along these African trade routes. Among the most significant of these were the religious ideas of Islam. In the early ADs, around 600s, Islam began winning converts outside of its native Arabia. By 711, Islam, whose followers are called Muslims, had spread all the way across northern Africa to the Atlantic Ocean. How was it able to spread? This new religious creed won wide acceptance, some through armed conquest and others through a promotion of religious solidarity. By the 900s, nomadic peoples who controlled the trade caravans in the Sahara had become Muslim as well. They in turn carried Islam across the Sahara into the heart of West Africa, where many people living in the region's cities and market towns would eventually embrace it. West Africa prospered primarily because of the gold trade. The Muslim conquest of North Africa greatly increased the demand for gold in the 800s and 900s because of the new Muslim states of the region used gold coins. Later in the 1200s, trade between Europe and North Africa experienced an economic revival as rulers of Europe shifted from silver and copper coins to gold coins. By the 1300s, as much as 2/3 of the gold in Europe and North Africa had come from trade with West Africa. Living on the edge, south of the Sahara, African peoples were perfectly poised and positioned to benefit from the growing trade in gold. Ghana, the earliest empire to emerge in AD 400s. The Soninke people of the first West African empire, Ghana, controlled the region's trade. After the Muslims conquered North Africa and the Sahara in the 600s and 700s, Ghana merchants grew wealthy from the gold and salt trade. The Ghana ruler allowed Muslims to build their own mosques. Mosques is the Muslim place of worship. Ghana's empire ended in the early 1200s because new gold mines opened in Bur. Trade routes to these mines bypassed Ghana. The Malinke people of Upper Niger Valley controlled the great gold trade from Bur. They conquered the Soninke people of Ghana and built the Mali Empire. By the mid-1300s, the Empire of Mali had spread east down the Niger River and west to the Atlantic Ocean. It reached its peak in 1300 under the leadership of Mansa Musa. New gold mines opened in the Akan region, so the trade routes shifted further east. This led to the rise of Timbuktu as a center of trade and Muslim learning. The Sorko people of the Niger River east of Mali built the Songhai Empire by the 800s. They used their canoes to control the trade along the river. The Songhai ruler Soni Ali and his army seized control of Timbuktu in 1468. His conquered land to the north and the south along the Niger River. The Songhai ruler Aski Muhammad made Timbuktu a great center of learning and encouraged more trade across the Sahara. The Songhai Empire began to decline in 1591. Guinea, located in Africa's southern coast, had small states and kingdoms because the area was made up of very dense forests. The Yoruba people of Ife and the Edo people of Benin were hunters, farmers, and traders. The rich farmlands and tropical climate enabled people to produce a surplus of food. Surplus food supported rulers, government officials, artisans, and artists. The food was also traded for copper and salt from the Sahara. The dense vegetation of Central Africa made the movement of people and goods difficult. Central African villages were located along rivers. People fished, grew wheat, and raised livestock. Some people were nomads. Many African societies were matrilineal, in which the lineage or descendant was traced through the mothers. The Kingdom of Congo began in 1400 along the Zaire River. Farmers produced food surpluses because of the fertile soil and abundant rainfall. The Mambu-speaking people of the Congo also built a large kingdom. Slavery existed in African society. Most enslaved people had been captured in war. They were either sold back to their people or absorbed into their new African society. African slavery changed when Arabs began to trade for enslaved Africans. In the early 1400s, the Akan people acquired enslaved Africans from Mali traders to clear the land and mined gold. The Portuguese purchased enslaved Africans to work on sugar plantations. Europeans set up sugar plantations on the Mediterranean islands. Sugarcane cultivation requires heavy manual labor and a large labor force, so Europeans used enslaved workers. In the 1400s, Spain and Portugal set up plantations off the west coast of Africa and used enslaved Africans to work the fields. After colonization of the Americas, traders shipped enslaved Africans to the Americas. They were taken from their own cultures and had to learn a completely new way of life in terrible conditions. Next, we will look at European cultures. In 1095, Pope Urban II worried that the Holy Land, the birthplace of Christianity, Jerusalem, was in the hands of Muslims. He feared that Christians would not be allowed to access holy religious sites. He organized a great meeting of Christians in Clermont, France. There he made an impassioned speech calling for Europeans to seize control of Christianity's holiest sites by going to war. The Crusades, called for by Pope Urban II in 1095, were almost 2 centuries of armed struggle to regain the Holy Land. For centuries, the Roman Empire had controlled much of Europe, with stable social and political order. By 500 AD, however, the empire collapsed. Western Europe became isolated, trade declined, and law and order ended. This period from about 500 AD to 1400 is called the Middle Ages. Feudalism, with not much of a central government, a new political system as feudalism developed. Under this system, a king would give estates to nobles in exchange for their loyalty and military support. Eventually, nobles owning the estates became strong enough to assume many of the powers usually held by government. They raised their own armies, dispensed justice, and minted coins. The nobles swore an oath of loyalty and promised to provide knights, or mounted warriors, for the royal army. By 1000, feudalism had spread throughout much of Europe. Wars spread throughout because there was a lack of a strong central government. As a result, nobles built castles or fortified manor houses for defense. The wealth of the feudal lord came from the labor of the peasants who lived on his land. A lord's manor or estate varied in size from several hundred to several thousand acres. Each manor included the lord's house, pastures for livestock, fields for crops, forest, and a peasant village. The Bayeux Tapestry, an embroidered cloth of 230 feet long, depicts the events leading up to the Norman conquest of England and culminating at the Battle of Hastings. Manoralism describes the economic ties between the nobles and the peasants. In return for protection, peasants provided various services for the lord, farming and making various payments for goods. Bandits and warfare made trading difficult, so the manor had to produce nearly everything its residents needed. Peasants rarely left the manor. Most were serfs, or people who were bound to the manor and could not leave it without permission. Around 1000 AD, Western Europe's economy began to improve. Many villages were able to produce a surplus of food because of new agricultural inventions such as a better plow and the horse collar. This revived trade in Europe and encouraged the growth of towns. After the fall of Rome, the Roman Catholic Church provided stability and order in Europe. People who were commoners and rulers who disobeyed the church laws faced excommunication. Excommunication barred people from participating in church rites. They also lost political and legal rights. The Crusades helped change Western European society by bringing Western Europeans into contact with Muslim and Byzantine civilizations of Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Trade increased in the Eastern Mediterranean and especially benefited Italian cities. The red dotted line seen here is trade routes, and the black dots are commercial centers. During the 1200s, an increasing demand for gold from Africa to make coins was a direct result of Europe's expanding trade with Asia. The rise of the Mongol Empire in the 1200s broke down trade barriers, opened borders, and made roads safer against bandits. This encouraged even more trade between Asia and Europe. By the 1300s, Europe was importing large amounts of spices and other goods from Asia. The Mongol Empire, however, ended in the 1300s, causing Asia to become many independent kingdoms and empires. As the flow of goods from Asia declined, European merchants began to look for a sea route to Asia to avoid Muslim kingdoms. Beginning in the 1300s, a number of changes took place in Europe, enabling Europeans to begin sending ships into the Atlantic Ocean to look for a water route to China and India. The Crusades and trade with Asia weakened feudalism. New towns and merchants gave monarchs a new source of wealth to tax. Armed forces opened and protected trade routes. Merchants loaned money to monarchs to search for a water route to China. Monarchs relied less on support from nobility and began to unify their kingdoms with strong central governments. By the mid-1400s, Portugal, Spain, England, and France emerged as strong states in Western Europe. About the same time unified kingdoms were emerging, an intellectual revolution known as the Renaissance began in Western Europe. This is around 1350 and lasted until about 1600. It produced great works of art and started a scientific revolution. Renaissance is a French word that means rebirth. In this case, it referred to a rebirth of interest in cultures of ancient Greece and Rome. European scholars discovered the works of the Greek and Roman philosophers, geographers, and mathematicians. They also began to read works of Arab scholars. By the early 1400s, Europeans had acquired new technologies to make long-distance travel across the ocean possible. They learned about the astrolabe, a device that uses the position of the sun to determine direction, latitude, and local time. From Arab traders, Europeans acquired the compass and lateen sails, which made it possible for ships to sail against the wind. In the 1400s, the Portuguese invented the caravel ship that was easier to steer and made travel much faster. Henry the Navigator set up a center for astronomical and geographical studies in Portugal in 1419. In 1488, a Portuguese ship commanded by Bartholomew Diaz reached the southern tip of Africa. In 1497, 4 Portuguese ships commanded by Vasco da Gama found a water route to Asia. It went from Portugal around Africa and across the Indian Ocean to India. This concludes the African cultures and European cultures video.